Good morning, everyone. It's great to see people joining. We have about 150 people in the room already. And I am really pleased to welcome all of you this morning. And although there are several significant sustainability-related benefits to our pandemic lives, like no travel, no food waste, no plastics that food is wrapped in, no washing of linens, and not being away from our families, there are also parts of our physical togetherness that I truly have started to miss. And reflecting back on the moment that we decided to postpone the conference last year, it seems ludicrous now that we had to even think about it twice, because Europe was shutting down its borders, and one by one speakers and participants, and I think, Wayne, you were stuck in the US somewhere, Claudia was in Vienna, or maybe was even traveling somewhere else. And we were all seeing how sort of the institutions or governments were telling them not to travel. Here in the UK, the government was still holding on to a short-lived, blissful ignorance. But with Claudia, Ashley, and Gian Giuseppe, we decided we would have to postpone for a year. And that seemed plenty of time. I think none of us thought that we were still going to be living our lives in front of a screen more than a year later. But I think so. We all probably had imagined this conference, and it was supposed to be the launch of the project, but the project has already started. We're meeting regularly now, and Claudia will talk a little bit more about that. But there is a certain magic of being in a room together, and I think that's what we're trying to sort of imitate, to bring some of that magic into the virtual space these days. And especially in Oxford, when you can, there's a buzz of sharing a space, sitting shoulder to shoulder, although sometimes unpleasant, on your back and your knees while seated in a conference rooms. The walking along historic Oxford, having lunch and dinner in college halls that conjure up these imaginaries of Harry Potter and sorting hats. Walking to a pub, through cobbled streets along the Radcliffe Canberra to share a pint of god-awful English beer or not so great wine in a pub. But hopefully we'll do all of that when we get together for a next conference. And I know that there will also be a conference in many different places. So hopefully we'll be both bringing together, I think, the benefits of these virtual spaces with the benefits of seeing each other physically and meeting each other. But in this virtual space, a lot is riding on the speakers. So no pressure to you, Wayne and Claudia, but we are really looking forward to hearing from you. And however, this is maybe contrary to what one expects, a lot is also riding on the audience. Because I think we have all come to appreciate that in many virtual conferences, a huge amount is happening in the chat. So do let us know where you're dialing in from. Do let us know if there's any thoughts you want to share. And please use the Q&A section to ask any questions. So a couple of years ago, a group of us from different European countries met in Leiden to think through what our next Creative Europe application should focus on. And we all knew the importance these projects can have for the sector, and Claudia will talk a little bit more about that, because we had previous projects like Ream and README and Switch that had guided our thinking. And Wayne and Claudia will talk about, sort of how we decided to focus on care, and Wayne will very much focus on the concept of care in museums. And as usual, in that meeting, Wayne's eloquent thinking inspired us all to think deeper and wider. And I believe it was Wayne who wrote most of the project too, with others chipping in where needed. And the idea of thinking care and museums as places of care, not just collections care, but to center a deeper and a wider care, was important to that meeting that we had. And as our gaze shifted from things to people to each other, then on to more than human matters, and how the collections we care for, the displays that we curate, might become spaces for creative discussions around museum futures in times of planetary precarity, which is the title also of this conference. Now, a project was born that followed on from the RIM project, which was really a project that aimed to bring together partners from across Europe to think with each other. And then we used that while sharing wonderful food and thoughts in different capitals of Europe. And it really did help bring this sort of group together of people who were thinking alongside each other, challenging each other's thinking. And then we had a project called Switch that centered concepts of migration and belonging and how our institutions might be spaces that offer a home away from home. How do we change our institutions to no longer feel like violent spaces? And to critically reflect and tell stories of how a migratory crisis had deep roots in histories of coloniality that lay materialized in our stores and in our exhibitions. And how do we start telling those stories with more urgency? So if we were to be part of a process of change, we also needed to make sure that our spaces felt that they were welcoming spaces to all and could be spaces that actually would, instead of sort of being parts that only would be celebrating certain parts of histories, would be telling more critical parts of histories and engaging with more critically with those materials, how they ended up here and what those moments of history, what the effect was of those moments, of violent moments of history of colonialism. And although the matters that we discussed on were important to our institutions, it's also the friendships, the commitment and the understanding that was forged that was very important for committing ourselves to see change through in the institutions we're part of and that we represent. Now we find ourselves in a period where a dramatic rise in environmental pollution, loss of biodiversity, and change of climate have made us all acutely aware of that precarity of our planet and how care might be able to, if we would care differently, how would that actually be able to affect and start thinking around planetary, because although planetary in cause and in scale, these climate changes and the loss of biodiversity, the negative effects of these environmental changes are unequally distributed, affecting most intensely some of those whose positions are already most fragile, including indigenous and formerly colonized communities. And this crisis, therefore, is contributing to a rising global insecurity, inequality, social inequality, racial inequality, and therefore requires a sort of movement around social justice and racial justice to be intricately linked with the thinking of these topics. Now, I think today is the first of a series of 6 talks. This is the first webinar in the Matters of Care conference series, hosted by the Pitt Rivers Museum, and it was due to kick off the project Taking Care last March. There's 6 different public webinars in the series. Registration for each of them is on the PRM and Taking Care website, and will be, there's students actually who are going to be live tweeting the conference. Each webinar is being recorded and it will be put on the PRM YouTube channel after the live event. We know that, Thursday mornings is as random a moment as any, I suppose, but and we know that there's people who won't be able to, make it in the mornings because they have other things that they need to do. But we hope that you'll be able to catch up on the YouTube channel and just look at the event after. And please do feel free to put any general comments in the chat and use the Q&A function to ask questions of the speakers. Now, in the opening session, first, project leader Claudia Augustad will introduce the Taking Care project and the museum partners, and then our keynote speaker for this session, Wayne Modest, will then share his thoughts on the museums as spaces of and for care. He'll do that in 3 parts. Is that correct still, Wayne? Probably, but there will be opportunity for you to ask questions. So do, from the start putting questions in the Q&A in the Zoom. I'll be monitoring that Zoom. I'm going to start with introducing Claudia, And then once Claudia has spoken, I'll introduce Wayne. Claudia heads the she's heading the Taking Care project, which is some of these EU projects are quite a hassle to have to administer. So we're very thankful for Vienna to have taken on that burden. They did it for the Switch project also last time. The project is co-funded by the European Union and started in October 2019. Now, Claudia has been curating the South American collections at the Welt Museum Wien since 2004. Her research focuses on collections from the Amazon and Tierra del Fuego. Material cultural and cultural memory are topics that she works on a lot: museums and colonialism, collaborative curatorship, and decolonizing museum practice. And we're very pleased to have you join us, Claudia. And please do, I'm going to hand over the mic to you so you can introduce the project and the project partners a little bit further.
Yeah, thank you very much, Laura, for this nice introduction, and also a very well welcome from my side here from Vienna. I'm so impressed because I just saw we have so many audience from all over the world, and this is also a benefit from having a webinar, because many of you maybe wouldn't have come to Oxford. So I think we should also see the good side of this very difficult time. And since more than 10 years, most of our partner museums are working together in different projects, like Laura already mentioned. And in the Taking Care project, we are 14 partners across Europe. We have in the UK, the Pitt Rivers Museum, our host today, the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at the Cambridge University. We have the National World Culture Museums in Leiden, Amsterdam, and Bergendal. In Belgium, we have the Africa Museum and Culture Lab. We have in Germany, the Linden Museum and the Mark Museum at the Rotenbaum. In Denmark, we have the National Museum. And in Sweden, the World Cultures Museum in Gothenburg and in Stockholm. We also have the Slovenian Ethnographic Museum in Ljubljana and the Museo Pigorini in Italy. And in Barcelona, we have the World Museum and Museum for the Instituto Cultural de Barcelona. And I really need to look at my paper, because now with 14 museums, we have so many partners. And I almost forgot the Museum in Marseille in France. So this is an amazing group working together, most of us more than 10 years. So it's a very safe place for discussion. We can discuss very openly all the matters. And I think Laura mentioned the most important points on our Taking Care project. And you can also follow us on our webpage, takingcareproject.eu, which is not only about the project, but we will also collect content related to the project. And you can always send a message if you also want to contribute to our discussion. So, but what I want to mention right now is the importance for being partner in such a project for our museums. Because when I think I joined the first time more than 10 years ago in Gothenburg, which was a very exciting meeting, because there was a breakout of a volcano at the end. So it was very interesting to find a way back home. And instead of a 3-hour flight, we were 26 hours on bus and train. But for me, this was like a start also to change the way I'm thinking about my work as a curator. I'm doing exhibitions, I'm working with communities. And even if in the last years, it is not really visible that our institutions are changing, because we are still working in the same hierarchies. We are still working in regional departments, which I think maybe we also have discussed in other conferences. But at the most important point is for me that I can see that people working and discussing in the project, they are changing the way of seeing their collections, working with other people, and that in general, the museums are more open spaces than maybe 10 or 20 years ago. And especially in the Taking Care project, with the possibilities of making exhibitions with artists, with activists, and having the possibilities of residencies, I think it's very important to discuss all these issues outside of our peer community, also with other people. And this will be, I think, the big chance that our museums will change in the future. And I think most of you know that ICOM, the International Council of Museums, is right now in a struggle to find a definition of what a museum is right now. And I think this is a good sign, because when we are not so self-assured, we maybe will have more possibilities for plural futures. So I make it short because we have a delay of almost 12 months, and I give back the word to Laura. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. So thank you for that introduction, and thank you for introducing all the partners. It really does make a huge difference to actually be bringing all these different people from different institutions to start seeing some of the ways that we can work together around these projects has been absolutely crucial to the developments in the sector over the past decade or more, actually. I think we started 2008 or so. And so I'm going to just say a word of thank you to the people behind the scenes also, because there's a whole number of people who are helping us to put together these webinars. So not for the whole project, but actually just for the Pitt Rivers Museum. Dr. Ashley Coutu, who's been incredibly important for the Pitt Rivers Museum in pulling together this webinar, making sure that all of the speakers are, have been brought together, that there's discussants for the different upcoming panels. Tandiwe Wilson, who is also behind the scene as the host of the Zoom webinar, and Beth McDougall, who you'll see answering your questions in the chats also. We also have 4 students who've signed up to live tweet the webinar, which is Hannah Eastham, Hadika Khan, Madeline Wooten, and Alice Saunders. And so we're very thankful to all of you for pulling all of this together for the conference. I'm now going to, I know that you're all here to hear Wayne speak. And Professor Wayne Modest is the Director of Content of the National Museums of World Cultures, the Wereldmuseum Rotterdam, and head of the Research Center of Material Culture, who have their own series of conversations which is absolutely phenomenal. And I do urge you all to, and I'm sure I've seen already people in the room who are also very much part of the community to go to the conversations that the Center of Material Culture is heading. Now, he's Professor of Material Culture and Critical Heritage Studies at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. And he used to be the head of the curatorial department at the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam. He was keeper of anthropology at the Horniman Museum in London and director of the Museums of History and Ethnography in Kingston, Jamaica. He's also, I think, the person who has more than, there's very few people who've actually made the sector change so much. And I know that there are moments when one wonders whether the sector ever changes, but just to see how much has happened in the past decades. And I know that when you'll be giving us new reflections again to think with, you'll be bringing us to a level of thinking that is going to be a bit more profound, challenging us, challenging also both our institutions, the individuals in our institutions, and possibly also some of the more wider global structures and systems that are in need of being challenged by our museums and the roles that the museums might be able to play in that. I know that you sent me a message yesterday that you were going to be extremely boring. I don't expect that that is actually even possible. So we're all looking forward to hearing from you today. Thank you. And I'm going to hand over to you, Wayne.
All right. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, all of the organizers, for inviting me. And I must admit that after your introduction, Laura, after Claudia's introduction, and just how you introduced me just now, I feel that I'm already failed to live up to the task of what is at stake. I want to say thanks first of all to the practices of togetherness that has helped to frame the work that we do here in the Netherlands, and that practices of togetherness, of thinking together, of thinking caringly and carefully together about how we imagine other futures together has been very nurturing for us. I mean, it's also a thing that helps us to be modest in terms of how we think we know what we think we know. And that has been what the collaborative projects over the past several years have been in our teams across Europe. But more than that, I want to honor the practices of criticism, of imagination that have come from outside the museum, that have invited us to change, practices that I always, for my own work, look to popular culture for. So I always start with Bob Marley, who says, "We refuse to be what you want us to be." He wants us to break back on system. What I will do here today is a little bit of a rehearsal of some things that Claudia and Laura did. I want to aim it within one of my favorite theorists' notion of conjunctures, to think through the different moments in which we have inhabited a space of change and thinking about change in our museums. I will rehearse a little bit of some of the story that has already been told, not necessarily because just to help frame where I want to go with this conversation. In the end, though, I will end with three propositions that I'd like to discuss with you. One is the notion of the museum as a site of extinction stories, a site for us to think an ethics of care helps us to tell stories around precarity and invites us, an institution, to more urgent practices to abate that kind of precarity. That's one. I want to think of radical care and what radical care might mean in terms of our museums and what is. And lastly, to tie ongoing stream, which is also a part of the project, I want to just provocation to end, which I will call restitution as care. And in that, what I'm interested to think about is restitution as a form of redistributing what we think of as heritage goods and therefore heritage potentialities, but also in the idea of planetary restoring restitution as a possibility of degrowth and thinking about smaller as being possible as more healthy planet. It seems like such a long time ago, and I know that, since we conceived Taking Care project. 14 partners came together to think what next for ethnographic and world cultures museums. Taking Care comes after several similar collaborative projects, as Laura has highlighted, README 1 and 2, and the most recent Switch, Sharing a World of Inclusion, Creativity, and Heritage. All of these projects, the earlier ones, were concerned with, even if not explicitly so, the role of the colonial past in structuring the work that we do as museums in the present, drawing on a longer history of what we could now describe as that reparative work of source community work. These projects try to address the question of colonial conceptually. For example, in questions thinking around the relationship between modernity and our museums that animated some of the conversations in Riemann, as well as practically, thinking more museologically around the questions of relationships, of collaboration, of questions of community. Switch was arguably our most political project, bringing together questions of colonialisms and citizenship and belonging. The pan-European nature of these projects also allowed us to think about how colonialism shapes different countries across Europe differently, and what that means for the different regimes of citizenship that we attend to. It was important for us during the Switch project, for example, to realize that a different language of the word community, or as I will deal with later, the possibility of even thinking race might be different across different European regimes. If we were to describe the conjuncture, that moment, what David Scott would call that problem space in which these earlier projects were inaugurated and done, one could call that the multicultural conjuncture. That heady moment of the 1990s and 2000s, where ideas of multiculturalism still held some hold on our imagination. To be sure, for several politicians across Europe, multiculturalism was already dead, nearly dead, or should have been dead long before. Still, as museums, we held on to the idea that a multicultural future was still possible, and that our museums could play a role in thinking how we live together with difference. What Paul Gilroy, and I'll come back to that, thinks about when he thinks through the notion of conviviality. Taking care then emerged at a time of our thinking about what next, what comes after multiculturalism. Such a what next was not intended as a practice of moving on, something we are well acquainted with within the neoliberal framework of what governments will call innovation, or research institutions as well. We need to be innovative, so let's move on. Or the colonial ideology of progress. But rather, it was framed within an understanding of what Donna Haraway would describe as staying with the trouble. It was not out of a feeling that we had done the colonial and therefore we could move on to something else. Rather, it was indebted to asking, how might we frame our questions differently to embed what we've already started? Already at the end of Switch, and here I quote from the publication that we pulled together, we had concluded that it was perhaps precisely in the very fact of our embeddedness in colonialism and in coloniality that might make us important for thinking about how to deal with colonial entailments in different ways. It was for us to mobilize, to think through, to fight against this coloniality as a way of understanding how it articulated with the broader, dense discussion that was happening outside our walls. Taking care also came in the wake of the robust critique from outside the museum demanding that we decolonize. Capacious in its understanding of coloniality, not simply in, oh, I have a bad page here, oh yeah, sorry. Not simply in its referencing of colonialism, but more how coloniality continued to structure systemic precarity based on an intersectional approach to difference. That is how Decolonize the Museum emerged. Global decolonization movements addressed at the museum saw the need to rethink race together with gender, with sexuality, with ableism, with capitalist extraction economies. In the US, for example, Decolonize This Place was invested in thinking the museum in relationship to practices of land dispossession and gentrification. Here across Europe, it was also invested in a thinking about dispossessive economies, what Dan Hicks describes as practices of taking. But taking care also happened within what I would like to call an Anthropocene conjuncture. At the time of writing the proposal, however, our world was animated by growing anxiety for two forms of precarity around which the project hinges. On the one hand, there was a growing concern for the future of our planet. Indeed, taking care came at a time of growing pro-planet activist politics, from Greta Thunberg to the hashtag Dakota Pipeline or Dakota Pipeline. These were planetary concerns about planetary futures and their relationships to people. and included the works of numerous other young activists across the world. We were excited to be part of taking care. Already at our museum here in the Netherlands, when we started to think in 2014 of what we could become and what a research center could be, and how our collections articulated with broader societal questions, the question of how to write other planetary futures were already on our agenda. While questions of the Anthropocene, the term that has become important to describe the current epoch of man-made climate change and species extinction, our interest had emerged from another space. While accounting for the importance of how such planetary questions were being discussed, especially within academia, our work was informed by scholars like indigenous philosopher and climate environmental justice scholar Kyle Powell-White, or, for example, or by the decolonial scholar Rolando Vasquez, who both of whom are collaborators, we think, in our project, who were invested in thinking about, and I quote, how modernity as an anthropocentric mode of steering the Anthropocene towards earthlessness and worldlessness. That is, not only a period of human influence over Earth, but as a time of Earth devastation and defuturing, and as the loss of the non-anthropocentric world. For Vasquez, like many other scholars, the notion of coloniality, which we were trying to address in our museums, is an attempt to counter the erasure of colonial violence from the solipsistic narrative of modernity. The geological evidence available today ratifies the First Nations' understanding of modernity, he writes, as mounted on extreme violence, on colonial violence, on land and on people, violence on our planetary future. This linking of coloniality to climate precarity was what animated our interest and our investment in thinking again about how we might think our collections or practices as part of a growing planetary precarity. You have heard me think aloud about this many times, perhaps, and that's why I said that I might bore you a little bit, and forgive me for that. But we were asking, how might we reframe our collections of hundreds of images of infrastructural work in the colonies beyond the language of industrialization, improvement, of, in the Netherlands, an ethical project of a betterment, whether in the building of trains or roads or bridges or in the images of mining? How might we think those images differently as part of resource depletion and planetary destruction? I'm reminded here, and this is certainly bad memory, of finding out during the curating of an exhibition on colonial furniture in Jamaica that already by the beginning of the 19th century, the mahogany growth in Jamaica had so vastly depleted because it was working in the service of luxury goods in the UK. If I remember correctly, but more than only stories of resource extraction, it was also another conception of materiality that animated our interest. That from a more historical materialism perspective, a Marxian perspective, that was concerned with the material conditions under which such extraction took place, under enslavement, and the unequal distribution of precarity through racialized labor in the present. Indeed, the raised, extractable, and sometimes expendable bodies that were also associated with such forms of extractive economies cannot be left unspoken about. And it is here that I want to liken the work or align with the work anyway, and honor the work of someone like Achille Mbembe, whose recent work around these topics, including the book, The Critique of Black Reason, has been thinking through this question of how capitalism holds us in snare as precarious peoples, and especially some people. By the way, just as a story, I was in a conversation with at University of Pennsylvania with Dipesh Chakrabarti, and it was amazing for me when he showed a little child playing in the park, and the child was playing with one of those bulldozer, I think those excavation machine with those front end that lifts sand, and he kind of asked the question about what do we think about it. And after a few failed attempts, he suggested that probably what we were doing was training that child to be a part of the destruction of the earth. He described the little tractor as an Anthropocene object. The second anxiety that animated our interest in taking care beyond the question of the planet was one of the rising concerns for the future of plural polities, of living together with difference. If the 1980s and 90s, for example, in the UK and more broadly across Europe, conversations about how to live with difference, and I had said before what Paul Gilroy calls a particular kind of conviviality, animated much of political discourse. By the writing of this project, multiculturalism, as I had said, was already pronounced dead. And there was rising xenophobic populism that had started to entrench, perhaps again, a notion of whiteness as normative conception for how to define nation states across Europe, actually, and America. Forgetting the colonial project. It was at that moment of writing a pushback against the possibility of plurality. Brexit, the so-called refugee crisis in the US, a turn away from the American dream and the narrative of migrancy. And in Brazil, the rabid anti-indigenous rhetoric, among other places all across the world, purported plurality as impossible. And with this notion of incommensurability, that they are different from us, incommensurably, with this idea of an impossible conviviality came the vile face of racism. It is this stubborn rhetoric of forgetfulness, of aphasia, as Anne Stoler has reminded us, of ignorance, according to Paul Gilroy. It is as if colonialism had never happened. To be white was to possess, to own, to belong, following Harris's wonderful article, Whiteness as Property. Or so was the narrative at the time of writing. It was within this raced context that taking care emerged. And as I was thinking together with the team, all of us, about what next, cultural anthropologist Ghassan Haj, a friend and another collaborator in our project, was with us at the RCMC in Leiden. Haj, apart from his brilliant book, White Nation, which was a study of the conundrum of the multicultural ideal in Australia, had just written a small book, which was called Is Racism an Environmental Threat? In this book, Haj suggests the racial crisis manifested by Islamophobia, and he broadens it to other forms of racializing project. And the ecological crisis not only happen to have an effect on each other, they are, he suggests, in effect, one and the same crisis, a crisis in the dominant mode of inhabiting the world that both racial and ecological domination produces and reproduces. It was for us in the project then to ask ourselves the question, how might we as museum been complicit in this dominant mode of inhabiting the world, in its extractive economies, in its racializing formation, in its exclusions, in its precarities? In reviewing this book, Rayburn Sculper writes that Haj reflects on how persistent Orientalist and Islamophobic reactions inform state policies regarding multiculturalism and aggressive assimilation. He describes the remarkable similarities between images of asylum seekers asylum-seeking Muslims as ungovernable waste, the remnants of late colonialism, conflict, and neoliberalism, and the plastic toxic waste, both floating in the ocean, people and plastic floating as expendable, he describes. Haj argues that the current global waste management strategies are late colonial projects of Europe's regime in relative decline that practice politics driven by fear of losing control over both the history-dominated regions and the world and their respective exploitative environments. It is exactly in this highlighting of the overlap of such discourses of waste with the presumed dispossessibility of some bodies, their fungibility, their expendability, and their being undesirable, that brings the concerns of these concerns to our questions in taking care, at least on my account. Interestingly, Ghassan Haj has one other concept that I think is pertinent to how we imagine the museum work that we do today, both in taking care, but more broadly. And that is the concept that he shared with me called the concept of availability. Land must be available to us. Bodies must be available to us to extract. But also, cheekily enough, I think he was saying, objects also need to be available to us. It was an interesting conversation I had in Berlin when a student and the conversation was actually on decolonization, and there was a response, and one person asked me, but if we give them back, will it not be, how do I get to see it? So in the context of decolonization, the question still was, how is it supposed to be available to me? I'm interested in that concept of availability. At the conjuncture of these two anxieties, we proposed care as a solution. Laura, I don't know if there are any comments yet, because I'm going to move to my second section right now, which is called on breathing. If there are none, then I can move into this, and then we can take a break in the next one, which is more directed as the museum.
Yeah, there's no questions yet, so please do.
Good. On breathing then. On the conjuncture of the unknowing, or what I call on breathing. While it is no way my intention to think about the people writing the Taking Care project as being prescient or knowing more or clairvoyant, little did we know at the time of writing that we would be struggling now in the face of a global pandemic that holds the world in its reins, demanding that we rethink differently about our relationship to the planet. In his April 2020 article, The Universal Right to Breathe, scholar Achille Mbembe reminds us of the global nature of this pandemic and its dangers to us all, but also the already established unequal distribution of life chances in the world and the unequal chances for death, what Laura described earlier as an unequal distribution of precarity. Mbembe writes, it is one thing to worry about the death of others in a distant land, and he was writing from spaces like here in the Netherlands, and quite another to suddenly become aware of one's own putrescence, to be forced to live intimately with one's own death, contemplating it as a real possibility. Such is, for many, he says, the terror triggered by confinement, having to finally answer one's own life, one's own name. We must answer here and now for our life on earth with others and our shared fate. Writing about the destructive relationship to the planet and indeed to life itself, he writes, all these wars on life begin by taking away breath. Likewise, as it impedes breathing and blocks the resuscitation of human bodies and tissues, COVID-19 shares the same tendency. Before this virus, humanity was already threatened with suffocation. If war there must be, it cannot so much be against a specific virus as against everything that condemns the majority of humankind to a premature cessation of breathing. Everything that fundamentally attacks the respiratory tract, everything that, in the long reign of capitalism, has constrained the entire segment of the world population, entire races, to a difficult, panting breath of life, of oppression. To come through this constriction would mean that we conceive of breathing beyond its pure biological aspect, and instead as that which we hold in common, that by definition eludes calculation, by which I mean the universal life to breath. What Mbembe does is that he challenges us to think about us as museums in that suffocating of life, in that taking away of life from those others in the vast majority of the world who we've left precarious. This was April 2020, less than 2 months before George Floyd, the Black American, would have been murdered under the knee of a white police officer with a similar plea, I cannot breathe, for breath. For within the systemic fight against plurality, his universal right to breath was foreclosed. Not even Mbembe, as he would have acknowledged later in a podcast with Paul Gilroy, would have known of the connection between those two events. But even while he, like us, would not have known, there is enough evidence for the fact that it is peoples of color, indigenous peoples and formerly colonized peoples of the world who are dying at the most extent through COVID-19. This killing would have resulted in the global, of George Floyd, I mean here, would have resulted in the global Black Lives Matter mobilization that demanded the right for all to breathe. It is in this context that taking care is now happening. And I'm asking of us in the museum world, what next? How can we care for those most precarious by colonialism? How can we care for breathing? As I go towards my ending, I want to mark the moment of what I call my conjunction number 4 on the judgment of history. I'm always hesitant, as many of you know, to be overtly political. I realize that we in the cultural sector always make the distinction between culture and politics. And 2, it is not everyone who can easily get away with being political. Yet, it would not be easy for me to miss this moment in which we are asking for care. Yet it would not be easy for me to miss this particular moment, this particular issue, which I will mention, when we are asking for care. Only last week, a report came out that is intended to tell us that institutional and systemic racism does not exist in the UK, that it plays no role in people's life chances in the present, in people's access to breath. Here I am uncertain if I am to celebrate this as an emancipatory moment, a moment when we are to feel liberated from the entrapment of the colonial past as it structures its strictures on our worlds in which we continue to live and live in precarity. Or I am to weep for what James Baldwin described already in 1968 when he says, how precisely are you going to reconcile yourself to your situation here, he asked. The migrant, the person of color, those made most precarious. How are you going to reconcile yourself to your situation here? And how are you going to communicate it to the vast, heedless, unthinking majority that you are here These people, Baldwin says, have deluded themselves that racism doesn't exist. He didn't say that. Deluded themselves for so long that they really do not think, he says, that I, James Baldwin, he says, am human. He bases this on their conduct, he says, not on what they say. Because to think that we could suggest in a time of planetary struggle that racism doesn't exist is to ask the question if we are not living in a delusional world. It is, of course, an ongoing discussion and a question of subjectivity. No, there is, of course, an ongoing discussion on question of subjectivity and objectivity in museums. It is based in a language of presentism and the idea that we cannot justly judge the past through the lens of the present. And while I understand that you in the museum world in the UK now, especially the nationals, are being threatened if you were to have a judgment on the past, I want to push back with 3 possibilities of how we can think judgment. Rather than thinking of objectivity or subjectivity, I would like to think that to not judge is to already be entrapped in a colonial judgment. You are underscoring the judgment of the colonizer. My second thing is, with this strange moment when people are trying to ask the question about diversity and inclusion and who works and the right to jobs, what pasts are we able to judge and what pasts not? Or more precisely, whose pasts are we able to judge and whose pasts not? Again, Paul Gilroy, like many others, has reminded us of how we can easily judge World War II as a past and what that meant for us. But the colonial is a past that should not be judged by in the present. And by way of Paul Ricoeur, I want to suggest that if there is any reason to judge the past, it is a reason to be able to commit to not repeating. It is a judgment that is future-oriented by suggesting that by having a judgment about the past, one can fashion more equitable and just futures. But this moment perhaps is in response to the global Black Lives Matter movement and Rhodes Must Fall in Oxford and in South Africa, to decolonize the museum here in the Netherlands. And many are now afraid that they will lose what was there before. I'm reminded of an article I wrote some time ago, which was called Caring for Some and Not Others, Museums and the Politics of Care in Post-Colonial Europe. I won't go into that article. It's not necessary, as I want to close off now. But one of the things I want to highlight that we mentioned in that article was that care is political. I did this with Marcus Balkenhol. We take it as a discursive practice that defines who and what is deserving of care, thereby drawing political boundaries between self and others. Care in relationship to histories is also political, about whose history is told, what is at stake in telling those history, and what does it mean to say to people that your history is not important. You are peoples without history. In that article, we suggested the museum as the quintessential place for care, a place for preservation, but not just preservation, for care. I want to move on, just highlight, and then I want to close with a few thinking places for us, because I think I'm running out of time now. But this for me likens into the similar discussion that is happening in France about the relationship to critical race studies and the fact that critical race studies is not French, that it is to the detriment of France, of Frenchness and what we understand as French. And one of the things I wanted to highlight, and this came to me from another scholar, his name is Manchia Diawara, and it was exactly around a question of care when he said it to me, because he said, if we understand Frantz Fanon, Edouard Glissant, and Aimé Césaire as central to the idea of thinking race in relationship to colonialism, and if now we are thinking that to think race and to think critical race theory and studies is not French, then we are suggesting that these three seminal and amazing scholars who were part of the French Empire were themselves not French. What does that say to us about the question of thinking care? All right, what I want to do now is to end with 3 provocations. I think I've spoken enough. I went on here because I have a whole heap of writing to think through the question of implicatedness and the ways in which we are, Michael Rothberg suggests that we should be, think about our relationship to the past and caring, not because we want to feel guilty or culpable, but because we want to care for the future, we want to be responsible for the future. So I wanted to skip over that, and I wanted to just close with my 3 provocations. My first is to think the ethnographic museum at the edge of extinction. I've been thinking for a while now about stories of extinction, which I have alluded to on some instance with some of you. My approach here is a cautious one, actually a frightened one, and I ask your advice because as I think this through, I would like to know if I've overstepped my boundaries a little bit. Realizing, as I do, that this is an argument that needs further research. The question of extinction actually came to me in thinking about an exhibition that we were to have done here at our own museum by the naturalist photographer Jimmy Nelson. My intention here is not to critique Nelson. I think that has already been done, and it is not in my interest to do that. What struck me at the time was the ways in which his project was framed, and many others, important critics says this, within the idea of anthropological salvaging. But more than just simply the similarity, I was struck again by how a narrative of before they pass away was not simply a justification for taking photographs or for taking objects within our framework, but also one that was enmeshed in a kind of feel-good colonialism, one that removed violence from the colonial project. We are to see colonialism here as benevolent, as compassionate, as good, as documenting before. One committed to science, preservation, to care. That's what it was supposed to be about. Yet what if we were to turn the story around, to think differently, to acknowledge colonialism's role in their supposed passing away? What if we were to change the narrative from before they pass away to before we make them pass away? I am aware of the long history of criticisms from indigenous peoples against this narrative of disappearance. And here is where my biggest caution lies. Yet my interest is in acknowledging. It is here that I would like to think of the museum as a site for telling extinction stories. Here I draw on the work of scholars such as Fandora and others who will be interested in thinking care for the human and non-human world as also a practice of telling extinction stories. The telling of extinction stories are practices of thinking about our own complicity in making our human and non-human world vulnerable. But it is also in an ethics of care, a care as what Pugh described as an ethical and a politically charged practice, which is committed to others, more caring and careful futures for others. And it is not so far-fetched within our museum. I'm reminded of the rather troubling objects that we have in our collections that are made of, what do you call it, of feathers. Or not troubling, but the feather work, and how might we think about these questions of feather and its relationship to birds that are almost extinct. I was talking to our curator Martin Berger, who could highlight a few of those objects. What if we were to set ourselves as part of a practice of telling the stories of those forms of extinction? Of the rhinoceros or the elephant, of birds of paradise. And in Tom van Dora, he does a wonderful thing when he thinks through the question of the dodo as the first extinct object. It is this that I want to think of our museum as a site for telling stories about languages that we might have made extinct. But also, and I want to think with Dan Hicks here, about the fact that the punitive expedition might itself have been imagined as an act of extinction. Extinction stories, then, I want to provoke, are stories that care for the planet and its people. They are stories that, like John Tronto suggests, are part of everything we do to repair, maintain, and continue our world so that we can live in it as well as possible and as well with one another as possible. I want to close there because I think I have too much and I think I've run out of time now, right? And in running, the last two things that I wanted to just quickly close with was thinking with you about radical care. And I draw on this description by Hobart and Neese, where they describe, and they continue, because radical care is inseparable from systemic inequality and power structures. It can be used to cohere subjects into new forms of surveillance and unpaid labor, to make up for institutional neglect. So it is not care that does not acknowledge its own violences. It is us that are part of the structure of power and violence. So we need to acknowledge it. Still, they suggest radical care follows how Elizabeth Pavanelli has defined it, that helps us to imagine and enact the otherwise. And where more than any place else can we enact and think the otherwise than in the Ethnographic Museum, a place where otherwise ways of being, otherwise ways of knowing, otherwise ways of living with the planet has always been a part of its collections and the project. Taking care is about the otherwise. I will close there and leave it open for you to ask questions. And one of my last questions to you is, does my suggestion about restitution as reparation, no, as repair, but as degrowth, does that sound a little bit strange? Am I being exaggerated? Thank you all for listening. Also, okay. There's a question. There's a relationship between the museum and the Congolese people in Norway. The objects are there. They will not disappear tomorrow. I want the items to be available to me and my descendants. This is our vision. Now, is it our task to find out how can this best happen? I don't know the participant's name because it was typed, I think, by somebody else, but I agree with you. The question of that sort of availability was what animated our previous project and continues to animate our work in thinking around the question of availability and accessibility. And this is something that my colleague Henrietta Lici has attended me to very, very recently as well, that we very often speak about available, but not necessarily access, and that we need to think more critically about what that might mean. So the answer to your question is yes. And it is exactly in the question how I understand the notion of redistribution that I think that that kind of availability could be made possible. So that's one question. Martin Berger asked, Martin, thank you. I wonder which technique and tools museums have to care, how care can be built as a criterion within the products of the museum create, and what this means for the conceptualization of what the museums does. I mean, actually, Martin, that is in itself an amazing, an important question, because in the project as we had articulated it, and by the way, I want to correct Laura on one thing, because I think that I will never claim to have written the project. If it is bad, then it's my fault, but if it is okay, I think all of us wrote it together. So Laura, I needed to say that. But Martin, just to answer that question, I think one of the strategies, and I want to acknowledge the work that we as museums have been doing already, because I think that one of the strategies of collections as caring and collections management as caring, not pressed into a preservationist drive, a 19th century preservationist drive of keeping, but rather caring as a relational practice of objects in relation to communities, in relationship to people, of caring for communities as we care for objects as well, is about a practice of how museums can participate in care. And I think that, for example, one of the projects that we have as a careful and caring project is the Waka project that we have in Leiden. But more precisely, I think one needs to acknowledge that work that we've been doing in relationship to how Laura Pierce has defined source community work has always been embedded in thinking care as a practice. Now, care has other framings. For example, how do we be nonviolent in our text? What is at stake that people come in and feel cared for, that they're feel that it's a caring environment? And that has also to do with your staff, and how do you create a careful environment for staff? So I think that there are multiple ways in which this narrative of care can be translated to the technique and the technology of the museum, if we are to think it beyond its preservationist mode and into other mode. And I think, as I said to you, redistribution as care is definitely a possibility. Laura, are you back? No, you want to decide which questions I answer?
So I can't see all of it because I had to back in, but I can see the new ones. So there's I think one from Tone, which you've probably already taken, around whether there's institutions that have established agreements within diaspora communities related to museums with colonial collections. Is that something that you've?
Well, I think that you know, that has been and in a funny way, one of the things that I think we've been trying to do within the question of the ethnographic museum, and I am going to make my cards clear here. While I acknowledge the protracted relationship of our kind of museums with a coloniality and a certain kind of violence, all of what I presented now is I presented it as a hopeful idea for the ethnographic museum, because I believe in them as sites where this care can be inaugurated, but actually, as going back to what Claudia said earlier, as a site where we can imagine plural futures and help to fashion them. And so in saying that, and in criticizing us, because I am one of the biggest critiques of our own museum, critics, I also must acknowledge that the work of doing source community, which what I was thinking about as falling within the multicultural conjuncture, was a work that also had these kind of partnerships. It was embedded in notions of partnership. So many museums had them, even if they did not very often undo the power relations that they were intended to do, and the idea of the possessive notions that are embedded in them. They didn't do that, but they were some of them that did it. Can I just say that in speaking of judging history, I agree with you about the fact that colonialism exists in the present, and of coloniality exists in the present. I think that that is exactly the question of the decolonial think school, to acknowledge that coloniality and colonial entailment and its duress are already ensnares us in the present. And that's why I wanted to highlight the nature of racism. It was strange in the UK to see that report come out at the same time that Steve McQueen's film was on TV, which acknowledges that protracted history of racism in the UK. So, you know, the racializing project that we still inhabit is a part of the colonial project as an afterlife, as Saidia Hartman would describe it.
Yeah, I think that was referring to Tupton's question
Yeah,
around
clubbed. Yeah,
the
yeah.
coloniality in the present community or states actually being colonized by other states, such as in the case of Tibet, for example.
But I think that actually that is actually a beautiful question for another reason why the Taking Care project is interesting, because if one were to tie the colonial project to a project of extractivism, which it is, and land and oil and whatever, that we see that continuing, right? So it is not that the reshifting of power regimes have happened so vastly in the world. And I think that one has to account for those tentacular histories. And for us at our museum and for all ethnographic museums, I think that once we start tying our collections to that different histories of planetary destruction, then we will understand how coloniality still exists in the present. That it is still here. It is not something that has gone. It is a part of it. So I think that we should see that in terms of how we understand our regime of thinking.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a question also by Lotten. Does the established role of museums as tools for intergenerational communication attain a new significance in the anthropocentric bundle of crisis?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in intergenerational what? Let me hear it again.
The intergenerational communication, as the museums as tools for intergenerational communication.
Yes, I think definitely. If one were to think of the work that we do as intergenerational, in both in its sense of our orientation to community and community as intergenerational, so what we might do with certain indigenous communities, but in another sense as intergenerational in knowledge and wisdom practices, I think definitely. In a funny way, if this is what you're speaking of, Lotte, our museum has a certain kind of arrogant mission, and I'm not saying we're doing it well, right? But the arrogant mission in this moment of intergenerationality is to try and make us all implicated in a certain kind of better futurities. It is to be able to make that connection historically, so that we create, if I were to suggest a mission that we could have as museums, is we create advocates for plurality, for an anti-racist future, for a planetary betterment. And that is always an intergenerational project. I'm interested in that advocacy, as museums create advocates for a plural, caring future. That is, for me, a mission that we could hold on to.
There's two more questions I want to take, which is one from Paul Bassou and one from Judith.
Oh, yes. Paul, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be here, Paul.
He's actually saying thanks, Wayne, for a wonderful and very thought-provoking talk. He says he can't quite frame his question, but I suppose, he says, this relates to the contraction you articulated about ethnographic museums' embeddedness in coloniality, in which salvage and representations of otherness implicates them in colonial violence. Mm-hmm. And yet there's also the possibility of using the legacies of that violence to imagine other ways of being, knowing, etc. How does this relate to this issue of judgment?
Yeah, no, but I mean, actually, Paul, that is a sweet question. And know I need to go and rethink, go back to that. I've been reading a few books. There is actually a book that just came out on the question of historical judgment, and one on presentism, which I've been reading because I've been interested in this narrative that we've come to learn. It was this at the time, or it was that at the time. In a funny way, I think it is exactly the point that I want to raise. I believe differently that to come to a judgment on what coloniality has done and continues to do is to be able to mobilize that judgment in fashioning other futures. I think that what we do when we say we cannot judge the past, or when we say we can't judge certain past, because as I tell you, there are pasts that we are happy to judge. We judge past in many ways. When we say we can't judge the colonial past, which is a strange thing, in doing that, what we might do is, and I think what people are actually saying is that we can't describe people as evil or that they were bad or whatever. I come from a different perspective because I think to be able to make that judgment is to be able to try to fashion other kinds of futures. That is exactly ties back to Lotta's question about the practice of future thinking, planetary plural thinking, thinking in common together. So I think that it's a nice point. I'll go back to it, but that is how I would answer it right now. And the
Thank you.
last point.
Last question from Judith is, she indicates that she loves your idea of reparation as repair. My current PhD is called the Healing Museum, repatriation as a way to create healing, and is very much along the same lines. My finding is that for this to work most effectively, we need to deconstruct how the traditional museum is structured. The Victorian hierarchy, particularly of national museums, does not serve this type of transformation. Have you any thoughts on this, and do you mind if I contact you afterwards to discuss your thoughts on this? Oh, this is
wow!
like from
so
Dublin.
we already have an appointment. Yeah, but I you know, one of the things that I think is and I've enjoyed this practice of working together with our colleagues across the museum, and perhaps what you're alluding to is something that I've said, but we've said generally, that the demand to decolonize, the demand to heal, the demand to imagine other futures actually emerges to confront that. One needs to confront the very foundational structures on which we understand the museum to work. So it's like the discussion that is going now about ICOM and the definition, which I find a fascinating discussion. That, you know, there is, on the one hand, we say that the new definition is kind of too ideological and political. And on the other hand, we say that the old one was a definition because it captures the whatever. And that has been going on in the ICOM conversation for a long time. But if one were to look at the old definition, one would have to acknowledge that actually very few museums actually do research anymore. So most of us haven't lived up to that. And when we say in the service of society and our development, most of us haven't been including people of color for a long time. So it's only a part of society. So we haven't been living up to that either. So the old definition was already a failure for many of us. So my interest in thinking care is actually to think a need to reorder the museum as structure. And that's when I think the decolonization movement is beautiful in its capaciousness, because it demands that we break down the very conceptual framing on which the museum is held. What does it mean to exhibit? What might it mean to curate? It demands that we go back to a more conceptual argument, and not just, because if we don't, we're not going to change anything really quickly. So I think that that is where I see your question, and I'd love to speak to you. The only thing is that if you want to do your PhD soon, finish it soon, then I'm not able to talk to you because I have an agenda that's full until May. I'm sorry for that. One last point, though, I want to bring to the audience, which I didn't say. and I've been thinking about it also with a colleague of mine here. I want to honor him, Erdogan. That if you were to think of the question of historical judgment and how we feel attacked by that, it is a similar way in which we approach the decolonization movement. We approach it as a negative signifier, a tearing down, a breaking apart. And I want to suggest that to think it that way is actually to think it from the perspective of the colonizer. Because if you were to think decolonization from those who gained independence, then it is only a hopeful thing. It is joyous. It is loving. So I think that in a way, this question of reframing the museum and thinking it otherwise, and that's why I think CARE is a lovely envelope for what that might look like with all of its violences as well, is that it imagines a future, a novel mode of thinking the museums in the future that is invested in inaugurating different kinds of worlds that can only be positive. So let us take decolonization as love, joy, care, beauty. It is so sweet, rather than as all of the negatives that we think that we're breaking down. We're not breaking down, we're building, inaugurating a new moment.
And that is a beautiful way to sort of come to a conclusion of the exchange of thinking. And thank you so much, Wayne, for the richness of the multiple provocations, but also very much the way that you've been able to bring us, I think, to think about this again anew, introducing these new concepts around availability that you're thinking through, about judgment, which already are starting up a conversation with several people joining in. I'm sure there are questions that we missed that we've not been able to answer, but we've run out of time, more than out of time. I want to invite you all to the next week's conversation, and we will post the information on next week's conversation. I want to thank you, Wayne, in particular, for the time that you took in, ordering your thoughts, structuring them, and bringing them in such wonderful ways. Next week, we'll talk about Indigenous knowledge and community environmental justice with Pauline von Hellerman, Joaquine Rodriguez Fernandez, and Ashley Cotou. I look forward to seeing all of you there too. So thank you, and thank you also, Claudia, for having joined us, and thank you to all of the participants for having joined the first of a long series of these.
Thank you all.